Emmanuel Nwude walked into a London hotel in April 1995 carrying forged documents stamped with the official logos of the Nigerian government. He introduced himself as Paul Agwuma, the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. The man sitting across from him, Nelson Sakaguchi, director of international operations at Brazil's Banco Noroeste, believed every word. Over the next 3 years, Sakaguchi would authorize 94 wire transfers moving $242 million out of his bank's Cayman Islands branch. The money flowed through American clearing banks, passed through Swiss vaults, and eventually landed in accounts controlled by Nwude and his syndicate. When the fraud finally surfaced in 1997, it triggered the collapse of a 78-year-old financial institution, led to the creation of Nigeria's first major anti-corruption agency, and revealed that one of the world's most sophisticated banking frauds had been conducted almost entirely by fax machine and telephone. Nwude wasn't a hacker. He was a director at Union Bank of Nigeria, the country's second-largest financial institution. His weapon wasn't code. It was institutional trust. Emmanuel Nwude held the title Owel of Abigana, a traditional honorific suggesting social standing in his community in Anambra State, eastern Nigeria. By the mid-1990s, he occupied a director's seat at Union Bank of Nigeria. The position gave him access to SWIFT transfer protocols, the administrative language used in international banking, and the specific procedural knowledge required to bypass standard verification checks. His professional standing provided what investigators would later describe as a veneer of legitimacy. He understood how money moved between institutions, which phrases triggered compliance reviews and which didn't. Union Bank of Nigeria was the country's second-largest financial institution at the time. Directors at this level participated in high-stakes international transactions daily. They reviewed documentation for corporate loans, approved credit facilities for multinational operations, and coordinated with foreign correspondent banks. Nwude's role placed him at the intersection of domestic Nigerian finance and the global banking system. He attended conferences where international banking standards were discussed. He received training on anti-money laundering protocols. He knew the procedures because enforcing them was part of his job description. His social standing extended beyond the professional sphere. The title Owel of Abigana connected him to traditional power structures in Anambra State. These connections provided influence that transcended official institutional authority. In Nigerian society of the 1990s, such titles carried weight in both traditional communities and modern business environments. They signaled someone who commanded respect, who had obligations to community members, and who could be trusted to honor commitments. Nwude leveraged this dual identity throughout the fraud, presenting himself as both a modern financial professional and a figure embedded in traditional social hierarchies. The syndicate he assembled was composed primarily of individuals from Anambra State. This geographic concentration was significant. Anambra would become infamous during this era for organized criminal networks, particularly those involved in advance fee fraud. The regional connection provided a basis for trust among conspirators. They shared language, cultural references, and social networks that made coordination easier and defection less likely. Family ties and community obligations reinforced the operational structure. Nzeribe Ede Akali initiated the fraud by sending the first contact to Sakaguchi in March 1995. Akali had experience with advance fee schemes, though none at the scale he and Nwude would eventually achieve. His role was to make initial contact, establish the premise of the investment opportunity, and gauge the target's susceptibility. Akali understood how to craft correspondence that appeared official, how to invoke authority without providing verifiable details, and how to create urgency that discouraged careful investigation. Christian Ikechukwu Anejimba and his wife Amaka Martina Anejimba formed the second operational tier. Christian managed accounts and facilitated transfers, coordinating with banks across multiple jurisdictions. He had knowledge of offshore banking structures and understood how to create corporate entities that could receive large wire transfers without triggering immediate scrutiny. Amaka's role initially involved administrative support, managing documentation, and coordinating communication between syndicate members. Christian would become a central pillar of the operation until his assassination in 1998, an event that remains one of the case's most significant unresolved elements. After his death, Amaka took on a more prominent role managing the proceeds, demonstrating capabilities that suggested she had been more deeply involved than her initial support role indicated. Emmanuel Afalu and Abam Asakwi participated in the layering and integration phases. These stages of money laundering required different skills than the initial extraction. Layering involves moving funds through multiple accounts and jurisdictions to obscure their origin. Integration involves investing laundered money into legitimate business activities, creating the appearance that the funds came from legal sources. Afalu and Asakwi coordinated with local bureau de change operations to convert currencies, established shell companies to receive transfers, and identified real estate and banking sector investments where the syndicate's money could be deployed. The target was Nelson Sakaguchi. He oversaw Banco Noros offshore operations, including its virtual branch in the Cayman Islands. That branch was a critical component of the bank's capital structure but suffered from insufficient oversight. It operated with minimal dual authorization requirements, a deficiency that would prove catastrophic. Sakaguchi had the authority to execute large transfers without triggering automated alerts typical of domestic Brazilian banking. The Cayman branch functioned as a jurisdictional black box where nearly half the bank's total capital could be diverted without immediate detection. Sakaguchi's position made him an ideal target. He had authority over substantial funds. He operated in a branch with weak internal controls. He was physically and administratively distant from the bank's headquarters in Sao Paulo, reducing the likelihood of informal oversight from colleagues who might notice unusual patterns. He was also ambitious. Evidence from the investigation suggested Sakaguchi saw the Nigerian investment as an opportunity for personal advancement within the bank. If he could facilitate a profitable international transaction, it would enhance his reputation and potentially lead to promotion. This ambition made him vulnerable to the syndicate's approach. The selection of Sakaguchi was not random. The syndicate researched potential targets, identifying banking officials with a combination of authority, weak oversight, and personal ambition that made them susceptible to the scheme. Nwude's position at Union Bank gave him access to information about which international banks had lax controls, which officials had reputations for aggressive deal-making, and which jurisdictions provided regulatory cover for questionable transactions. The targeting was systematic and informed by insider knowledge of the global banking landscape. The deception began with a fax. In March 1995, Nzareb Akali sent correspondence to Sakaguchi using the name Taffeta Williams, identifying himself as a senior official in Nigeria's Ministry of Aviation. The message informed Sakaguchi that a contract, numbered FMA 132-01982, had been awarded for the construction of a new international airport in Abuja. The project required foreign partnership to facilitate administrative requirements. An initial sum of $39 million was ready for remittance. The contract number was fabricated but formatted correctly. Nigerian government contracts followed specific numbering conventions, indicating the issuing ministry, the fiscal year, and the contract sequence. The syndicate's use of a plausible contract number demonstrated attention to detail that distinguished their operation from cruder advance fee schemes. The number suggested legitimacy without being verifiable by anyone outside the Nigerian bureaucracy. Sakaguchi would have no easy way to confirm whether contract FMA 132-01982 existed, and the effort required to investigate would seem disproportionate to the potential payoff. The choice of Abuja was strategic. Nigeria's capital was undergoing rapid development in the mid-1990s, and state-funded infrastructure projects resonated with the emerging market investment fervor of the period. The federal government had relocated from Lagos to Abuja in 1991, and the new capital required massive infrastructure investment. Roads, government buildings, utilities, and transportation facilities were all under construction. An international airport fit logically into this development narrative. The project appeared plausible to Sakaguchi, who saw an opportunity for the bank to earn commission fees on a large-scale government contract. The initial correspondence carefully calibrated the request. It did not ask for money directly. Instead, it offered an investment opportunity. The Nigerian government had funds available but needed a foreign banking partner to facilitate the transaction due to administrative requirements. This framing positioned Sakaguchi as a facilitator rather than a victim. He was being offered a chance to participate in a profitable deal, not being asked for charity or a loan. The psychological positioning was critical. Sakaguchi would perceive himself as a sophisticated financier exploiting a regulatory arbitrage opportunity rather than as someone being conned. The mention of $39 million was also calculated. The amount was substantial enough to generate interest, but not so large as to seem implausible. It represented a realistic budget for a major infrastructure project in a developing country. The figure suggested the Nigerian government was serious and well-funded without straying into the realm of obvious exaggeration. Later in the fraud, the total extracted would reach $242 million, but beginning with a more modest figure reduced initial skepticism. The correspondence escalated to a face-to-face meeting. In March or April 1995, Nwude met Sakaguchi at a hotel in London. The meeting represented a significant escalation in the fraud's sophistication. Most advanced fee schemes of the era remained purely remote, conducted through mail and telephone. A face-to-face meeting required greater planning, expense, and risk. It also dramatically increased the scheme's credibility. Sakaguchi was meeting a senior Nigerian official in person, examining physical documents, and engaging in the type of direct negotiation typical of legitimate international business deals. During this encounter, Nwude assumed the identity of Paul Agwuma, the actual governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria at the time. This impersonation was the fraud's masterstroke. Agwuma was Nigeria's highest financial authority, responsible for monetary policy, banking regulation, and international reserves. If the governor of the central bank endorsed a project, it carried the full weight of the Nigerian government. Nwude's choice to impersonate Agwuma rather than a lower-level official reflected his understanding that credibility increased with authority. A meeting with a ministry official might warrant skepticism. A meeting with the central bank governor would overcome most reasonable doubts. Nwude presented forged documents bearing official government seals. The documents included letterhead from the Central Bank of Nigeria and the Ministry of Aviation, project specifications for the proposed airport, and financial statements showing the funds available for the contract. The forgeries were sophisticated, incorporating correct logos, fonts, and formatting. They included bureaucratic language typical of Nigerian government documents, references to specific regulatory frameworks, and signatures with official titles. The documents would not withstand forensic examination, but they were convincing enough for a cursory review by someone unfamiliar with Nigerian administrative procedures. The choice of London as the meeting location was deliberate. It projected international legitimacy and removed Sakaguchi from the more scrutinized environments of Brazil or Nigeria. A meeting in a global financial capital would not raise the same red flags as a meeting in Lagos or Enugu. London was neutral ground where international business was routinely conducted. The location suggested that the Nigerian government operated at a sophisticated level, engaging with international partners in established financial centers rather than insisting on meetings in Abuja. The choice also provided practical advantages for the syndicate. London's large Nigerian expatriate community made it easy for Nwude to blend in. The city's scale and anonymity reduced the risk of chance encounters with anyone who might recognize him as someone other than Paul Agwuma. Nwude's impersonation relied on detailed knowledge of institutional protocols. He spoke the language of central banking, using technical terminology related to reserve requirements, exchange rate management, and international settlements. He referenced relationships between the Central Bank of Nigeria and international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. He discussed Nigeria's economic challenges, including inflation management and currency stabilization, with the fluency expected of someone who dealt with these issues professionally. Sakaguchi, despite his experience in international finance, found the presentation compelling. The forged documents, the London setting, and Nwude's command of banking procedures combined to create an illusion that survived initial scrutiny. Later in the fraud's timeline, the syndicate staged elaborate environments in Nigeria. When Sakaguchi visited Enugu during subsequent negotiations, a private house was decorated to resemble a government office. The transformation was detailed. Official portraits of Nigerian leaders hung on the walls. Filing cabinets contained folders labeled with ministry designations. Desks were arranged in the formal layout typical of government offices. Individuals played the roles of directors of budget and planning, wearing appropriate business attire and carrying themselves with bureaucratic authority. The theatrical approach ensured that Sakaguchi remained psychologically immersed in the deception even as the requests for money grew larger. The staging in Enugu represented a significant investment of time and resources. The syndicate had to rent or control a suitable property, furnish it appropriately, recruit and brief individuals to play supporting roles, and coordinate timing so that Sakaguchi's visit coincided with the appearance of normal government operations. The effort demonstrated the syndicate's commitment to maintaining the illusion at every stage. They understood that each interaction needed to reinforce the previous one, building a cumulative impression of legitimacy that would withstand Sakaguchi's growing doubts as the requested payments increased. The fraud did not begin with a request for $242 million. It began with $35,000. At the London meeting, Nwude explained that processing fees were required to initiate the contract's funding release. The fees covered administrative expenses related to document preparation, regulatory filings, and interministerial coordination. The amount was small relative to the $39 million commission Sakaguchi expected to facilitate. Paying $35,000 to unlock access to millions seemed like reasonable due diligence from a business perspective. Sakaguchi made the first payment in cash, handing it to Nwude during their London meeting. Once that threshold was crossed, Sakaguchi became a participant in an illegal transaction. The payment itself violated Banco Noros policies regarding unauthorized fund transfers and undisclosed foreign transactions. Sakaguchi had not informed his superiors about the Nigerian deal. He had not submitted the transaction for internal compliance review. He had not documented the payment through official banking channels. The psychological mechanism was now engaged. Reporting the suspicious nature of the deal to his superiors would mean admitting his own role in the irregularity. Self-preservation instinct discouraged him from seeking help or raising concerns that might expose his unauthorized activities. Between May and June 1995, the request intensified. Sakaguchi sent $4.65 million in 7 installments from Banco Noros's Cayman branch. Each payment was larger than the previous one. The progression followed a pattern. The first post-London transfer was relatively modest, perhaps a few $100,000. The second transfer was slightly larger. By the 7th transfer, individual payments exceeded $1 million. The escalation was gradual enough that each new request seemed like a reasonable next step rather than a dramatic departure from what Sakaguchi had already authorized. The syndicate introduced new bottlenecks with each transfer. Fluctuation charges appeared. The Nigerian government, according to Nwude's explanations, had to pay fees related to currency exchange rate variations. Because international markets were volatile, these charges accumulated unpredictably. Mandatory tax deposits became necessary. Nigerian law allegedly required advance payment of certain taxes before large government contracts could be executed. Value-added tax payments followed. Each new demand was presented as the final obstacle preventing the release of the promised $39 million commission. Each was accompanied by documentation, references to specific Nigerian regulations, and assurances that once this particular payment was made, the funds would flow immediately. Sakaguchi executed these transfers without the knowledge of his superiors at Banco Noros. The Cayman branch operated with insufficient oversight, allowing him to authorize large wire transfers without secondary approval. The institutional structure was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Banks implement dual authorization requirements specifically to ensure that no single individual can move substantial sums without review. Banco Noros' failure to enforce these controls in its offshore branch created the vulnerability that made the fraud possible. The bank's senior management in Sao Paulo assumed that standard controls were in place. They were not. The psychological toll on Sakaguchi grew as the amounts increased. He had committed himself to the investment's success. Each payment represented not just money but also his professional judgment. Admitting the deal might be fraudulent would mean acknowledging that he had been fooled, that he had violated bank policy, and that he had lost millions of his institution's capital through gullibility. The sunk cost fallacy operated powerfully. He had already invested $4.65 million by June 1995. Walking away would mean accepting that loss as permanent. Continuing meant there was still hope of recovery and even profit if the Nigerian funds eventually came through. Evidence emerged later that Sakaguchi had paid a voodoo priestess a substantial sum to perform rituals intended to protect the investment and ensure the Nigerian funds would eventually arrive. This detail, uncovered during the investigation, highlighted the desperation of a senior financier who had bypassed all rational internal controls and was now relying on supernatural intervention to prevent his career's collapse. The payment to the priestess was not a minor expense. Investigators found records indicating the amount was significant, suggesting Sakaguchi was willing to spend his own money to try to salvage a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. The resort to supernatural assistance indicated his psychological state. He knew rationally that something was wrong with the Nigerian deal, but he was too invested to acknowledge it openly or take action that would expose his unauthorized activities. By 1996, the fraud had hit its peak volume. Nwude and Christian Anejba sidelined Akali, taking direct control of managing Sakaguchi and the flow of funds. The shift in operational control reflected tensions within the syndicate. Akali had initiated contact and facilitated the early transfers, but as the amounts grew larger, Nwude and Anejba decided they wanted a greater share of the proceeds. Sidelining Akali reduced the number of people who would divide the money. It also centralized decision-making, allowing Nwude to exercise more direct control over Sakaguchi's manipulation. The requests no longer came from fictitious aviation officials. They came directly from the man Sakaguchi believed was the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. The shift in communication channels reinforced the fraud's credibility. Sakaguchi was no longer dealing with mid-level bureaucrats. He had direct access to Nigeria's top financial authority. This perceived elevation in relationship status made him feel increasingly important and invested in the transaction's success. He was a personal associate of a central bank governor, someone trusted with sensitive financial arrangements. The psychological flattery worked alongside the sunk cost pressure to keep him committed. The psychological pressure intensified. Sakaguchi had already sent millions. Walking away would mean losing everything he had already invested and exposing his unauthorized transfers to Banco Noros' board. The exposure would end his career and possibly result in criminal charges. Brazilian law took embezzlement and unauthorized use of bank funds seriously. Sakaguchi faced not just professional ruin but potential imprisonment. The stakes were now existential. Continuing the fraud offered the only path that might avoid catastrophe. If the Nigerian funds eventually came through, he could repay the money he had diverted, claim credit for a profitable international deal, and escape consequences. The probability of this outcome was vanishingly small, but it was not zero, and it was the only scenario that did not end in disaster. The syndicate utilized a complex web of intermediary accounts and shell companies to layer the funds and obscure their origin. Layering is a critical phase in money laundering. Extraction gets the money out of the victim's accounts. Layering moves it through multiple jurisdictions and entities to break the chain of custody and make tracing difficult. Integration invests the laundered money into legitimate businesses, completing the transformation from criminal proceeds to apparently legal wealth. Nwude's syndicate executed all three phases systematically. Key entities included Emmanuel Nwude Limited and African Shelter Bureau de Change Limited, both controlled by Nwude. Emmanuel Nwude presented itself as an automotive import and sales business. The company had proper registration documents with the Nigerian Corporate Affairs Commission, maintained bank accounts, and conducted some legitimate transactions to establish a business history. When large wire transfers arrived from overseas, they appeared to be payments for vehicle shipments or other commercial activities. African Shelter Bureau de Change held a license to operate as a currency exchange business. Bureau de Change operations in Nigeria handled large volumes of foreign currency legitimately, making them ideal vehicles for money laundering. Large transfers from abroad could be explained as currency exchange transactions for business clients or personal remittances from the Nigerian diaspora. Ocean Oil Marketing Co. Nig. Limited, controlled by Nzeraib Akali, was used to receive early installments. The company ostensibly operated in the petroleum products sector, a major component of the Nigerian economy. Oil-related businesses routinely received large payments from international clients, making substantial wire transfers unsurprising. The company's apparent legitimacy helped the transfers pass through correspondent banks without triggering suspicion. Banking compliance officers reviewing the transactions would see payments to a Nigerian oil marketing company and assume they related to energy trade. Stanton Development Corporation, a British Virgin Islands entity, served as a front for many of the larger transfers. The company was presented as an international infrastructure contractor with expertise in airport construction. Its corporate registration in the British Virgin Islands, a jurisdiction known for business-friendly regulations and confidentiality protections, gave it an appearance of legitimacy. The BVI registration also made beneficial ownership difficult to trace. Corporate records were not publicly accessible, and the jurisdiction's legal framework protected client confidentiality. Investigators would later need to obtain court orders to pierce the corporate veil and determine who actually controlled Stanton Development. The corporate structure created the appearance of legitimate business transactions involving aviation contracts and infrastructure development. When compliance officers at correspondent banks reviewed the wire transfers, they saw payments from a Brazilian bank to a BVI infrastructure contractor or to Nigerian automotive and energy companies. The transactions had plausible business narratives. The amounts, while large, were not unprecedented for the industries involved. The receiving entities had proper corporate registrations and banking relationships. Nothing in the surface details suggested fraud. The scheme's sophistication lay in creating a business facade that would survive routine scrutiny while concealing the actual criminal nature of the transactions. Sakaguchi executed 94 unauthorized wire transfers from the Cayman branch to 17 different recipients across the globe. The number of transfers is significant. 94 separate transactions meant 94 opportunities for detection. Each wire transfer generated documentation, passed through correspondent banks, and created a record in multiple banking systems. The fact that none triggered an investigation until 1997 demonstrated the profound weakness in international banking oversight during the mid-1990s. The transfers were not small or subtle. They moved millions of dollars per transaction. They went to unfamiliar recipients in multiple jurisdictions. They originated from an offshore branch with minimal business activity, yet they all went through without challenge. The money transited through several major international banks. J.P. Morgan Chase, operating at the time as Chemical Bank, served as the primary USD transit point for many of the transfers. As one of the largest American banks with global correspondent banking relationships, Chemical Bank processed enormous volumes of international wire transfers daily. The Banco Noros transfers would have been processed as routine business, lost in the flow of billions of dollars moving through the bank's clearing operations each day. Bank of New York acted as an intermediary for layered transactions, providing another node in the global network through which the stolen funds traveled. Swiss banks in Geneva received portions of the funds, providing what the syndicate hoped would be a jurisdictional break that would prevent tracing. Hong Kong banks were used by associates connected to the syndicate's eastern operations, adding another geographic layer to the laundering network. None of these institutions flagged the transactions as suspicious. The transfers appeared to come from a legitimate offshore branch of a recognized Brazilian bank. The receiving entities had corporate registrations and bank accounts in respectable jurisdictions. The amounts, while large, were not unprecedented in the context of international infrastructure financing. The global financial system's plumbing, specifically the SWIFT network and the lack of robust know-your-customer oversight in mid-1990s offshore banking, allowed the fraud to continue undetected. Banks relied on the assumption that other banks had already vetted their customers. If Banco Noroeste was sending money, Chemical Bank assumed that Banco Noroeste had conducted appropriate due diligence on the transaction's legitimacy. If the receiving entities had accounts at reputable institutions, those institutions must have verified their customers' identities and business purposes. These assumptions created a diffusion of responsibility where no single institution felt obligated to question transactions that seemed superficially legitimate. In October 1996, Sakaguchi sent $6.73 million for what the syndicate termed fluctuation charges. The concept of fluctuation charges exploited Sakaguchi's incomplete understanding of Nigerian financial regulations. Nwude explained that because the Nigerian naira was subject to exchange rate volatility, and because the government contract was denominated in dollars while certain domestic payments had to be made in naira, charges accumulated based on exchange rate movements between the transaction's initiation and its execution. The explanation sounded technical and plausible. It invoked real phenomena like exchange rate risk and currency conversion. Sakaguchi did not have the expertise to evaluate whether fluctuation charges of this magnitude were realistic for the transaction described, and his incentive was to believe the explanation rather than challenge it. In January 1998, he sent $4.75 million for VAT part payment. Value-added tax is a legitimate component of many international commercial transactions. Nwude explained that Nigerian tax law required advance payment of estimated VAT on government contracts above a certain threshold. The payment would be reconciled against actual tax liability once the project was completed, but it had to be deposited up front to obtain clearance from Nigeria's Federal Inland Revenue Service. Again, the explanation invoked real administrative concepts. Many countries do require tax deposits or escrow arrangements for large contracts. Sakaguchi had no basis to determine whether this specific requirement was genuine, and challenging it would risk derailing the deal at a point where he had already invested millions. Between 1997 and 1998, he sent a combined $9.09 million for tax deposits. These payments were characterized as mandatory contributions to various government revenue accounts required before contract execution. Each was accompanied by documentation referencing specific tax codes and administrative procedures. The documents were forgeries, but they were sophisticated forgeries that mimicked the format and language of legitimate Nigerian tax assessments. Sakaguchi reviewed them with increasing desperation rather than increasing skepticism. He was looking for reasons to believe rather than reasons to doubt. Each payment was accompanied by assurances that the Nigerian government funds would be released immediately afterward. Each assurance proved false. The pattern should have been obvious. 3 years into the fraud, Sakaguchi had sent millions for processing fees, fluctuation charges, VAT payments, and tax deposits, yet the promised $39 million commission had never materialized. No rational actor would continue under these circumstances, but Sakaguchi was no longer acting rationally. He was trapped by the sunk cost fallacy, by fear of exposure, and by the desperate hope that the next payment would be the last one required. The syndicate understood this psychology and exploited it ruthlessly. They calibrated each new request to be large enough to extract substantial funds, but not so large as to be impossible for Sakaguchi to arrange. They maintained just enough communication to keep hope alive without ever actually delivering the promised funds. The pattern continued until Sakaguchi had drained $242 million from Banco Noroeste Cayman account. The total represented nearly 2/5 of the bank's entire capital. The magnitude of the loss was extraordinary. Banco Noroeste was not a small institution. It had operated for 78 years, serving clients across Brazil. Its capital base supported lending activities, maintained depositor confidence, and ensured regulatory compliance. Losing 40% of that capital threatened the bank's viability. When the fraud was discovered, Banco Noroeste faced immediate collapse. Only a personal bailout by the bank's owners prevented a complete failure that would have wiped out depositors and creditors. In December 1997, Banco Santander was conducting due diligence for its planned acquisition of Banco Noroeste. The acquisition was part of Santander's broader strategy to expand its presence in Latin American markets. Brazil was a key target due to its large economy and growing middle class. Banco Noroeste represented an opportunity to acquire an established institution with an existing client base and branch network. The due diligence process involved reviewing Banco Noros' financial statements, examining its loan portfolio, assessing its capital adequacy, and verifying that assets and liabilities were accurately reported. During a joint board meeting, a Santander official inquired about $242 million sitting in the Cayman Islands branch. The question was routine. Large offshore balances warranted explanation during acquisition due diligence. Were these client deposits? Were they held as reserves? Were they committed to specific transactions? The Santander official expected a straightforward answer referencing the balance's business purpose. Instead, the question triggered confusion among Banco Noros senior management. The confusion was immediate and alarming. Banco Noros executives in Sao Paulo had no knowledge of the transfers Sakaguchi had been authorizing for nearly 3 years. The Cayman branch was supposed to handle routine offshore transactions for international clients. Its balances should have been modest and fully documented. A $242 million outflow represented a massive unexplained capital movement that no one at headquarters could account for. The fact that senior management was unaware of transactions involving nearly 40% of the bank's capital revealed a catastrophic failure in internal controls and oversight. When the details emerged, the scale of the fraud became clear. An internal investigation was launched immediately. Auditors reviewed the Cayman branch's transaction records, tracing the wire transfers back through correspondent banks to their ultimate recipients. They contacted Nelson Sakaguchi, demanding explanations for the unauthorized transfers. Sakaguchi initially attempted to maintain the fiction that the transactions were legitimate business activities related to a Nigerian government contract. As the investigation intensified and auditors began contacting the supposed Nigerian counterparties, the deception collapsed. There was no airport contract. The Ministry of Aviation had never awarded contract FMA 132-01982. Paul Agwuma, the real governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, had no knowledge of any transaction with Banco Noros. Sakaguchi had been defrauded, and he had defrauded his own bank in the process. Sakaguchi was suspended in February 1998 and subsequently dismissed. The dismissal was immediate once the fraud's extent became clear. Banco Noros could not afford to keep someone who had authorized the loss of $242 million on its staff. Brazilian authorities were notified, and criminal proceedings began against Sakaguchi for embezzlement and abuse of authority. His career in banking was over, and he faced the possibility of lengthy imprisonment. Banco Noros faced a capital crisis. The $242 million represented nearly 2/5 of the institution's total value. Without that capital, the bank could not meet regulatory requirements for capital adequacy. Brazilian banking regulations mandated that institutions maintain minimum capital ratios to ensure they could absorb losses and honor depositor obligations. Banco Noros had fallen below these thresholds. The bank was technically insolvent, unable to continue operations without an immediate capital injection. The Simonson and Cochrane families who owned the bank were forced to provide a personal bailout to preserve the sale to Santander. The families had owned Banco Noros for generations. The institution represented their legacy and their primary source of wealth. Allowing it to collapse would mean losing everything. They injected $242 million of personal funds to replace the stolen capital, effectively absorbing the entire loss themselves to keep the bank viable. Without that intervention, Banco Noros would have been seized by Brazilian banking regulators, its assets liquidated, and its depositors potentially suffering losses. Even with the bailout, Banco Noros ceased independent operations in 2001. The acquisition by Santander was completed, but Banco Noros' brand disappeared. It was absorbed into Santander's Brazilian operations, its branches rebranded, its systems integrated. The 78-year-old institution that had served Brazilian clients through multiple generations ceased to exist as an independent entity. The fraud had not just caused financial loss, it had destroyed the institution entirely. Forensic accountants working for the former shareholders began tracing the missing funds. The investigation required cooperation between Brazilian authorities, Swiss banking regulators, American correspondent banks, and international law enforcement agencies. Tracing international wire transfers across multiple jurisdictions is complex and time-consuming. Each transfer created records in multiple banking systems, but accessing those records required legal processes in each relevant country. Brazilian investigators had to coordinate with Swiss authorities to obtain Swiss banking records, with American authorities to trace transfers through J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of New York, and with Nigerian authorities to track the fund's ultimate disposition. The breakthrough occurred when investigators traced approximately $5 million to a Swiss account beneficially owned by Emmanuel Nwude. The discovery happened through meticulous analysis of the wire transfer patterns. Forensic accountants identified recurring recipient accounts and traced the beneficial ownership through layers of corporate entities. The Swiss account was registered under a corporate name. but investigators were able to establish through corporate records and banking documentation that Nwude controlled the entity. Swiss authorities froze the account in response to a formal request from Brazilian prosecutors. The documentary evidence contained in that account provided the key to unraveling the entire scheme. The frozen Swiss account contained transaction records showing the flow of funds from Banco Noros through intermediary accounts to the syndicate's final destination accounts. The records included wire transfer confirmations, account statements, and correspondence between the account holder and various intermediaries. Forensic teams were able to map the entire network of transfers, including those sent to Hong Kong, London, and Nigeria. The Swiss records functioned as a Rosetta Stone, allowing investigators to connect disparate pieces of evidence from multiple jurisdictions into a coherent picture of the fraud's mechanics. The tracing revealed the layered structure of the money laundering operation. Funds had moved from the Cayman Islands through American clearing banks to shell companies and tax havens, then onward to Nigerian entities, and finally into investments in real estate and banking sector stakes within Nigeria itself. Each layer served a specific purpose. The initial transfers to shell companies in jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands created corporate entities that appeared to be legitimate business counterparties. The subsequent transfers to Nigerian companies converted the funds into local currency and integrated them into the domestic economy. The final investments in real estate and banking acquisitions completed the laundering process, transforming stolen money into apparently legitimate assets. The syndicate had effectively washed the money through the local economy, acquiring assets that appeared legitimate on their surface. Real estate purchases were particularly effective for this purpose. Property in major Nigerian cities like Lagos and Abuja could be acquired through cash transactions that left minimal documentation. Once purchased, real estate generated rental income that could be reported as legitimate earnings. Banking sector stakes were even more sophisticated. By investing stolen money into shares of Nigerian banks, the syndicate not only laundered the funds, but also positioned themselves to influence the institutions that process their transactions. A shareholder in a bank has access to information about the bank's operations and relationships with regulators. This access could be used to protect against future investigations. The investigation also revealed gaps. Approximately $24 million of the stolen funds remained completely untraceable as of 2005. The missing money represented roughly 10% of the total theft. Despite years of forensic accounting work and cooperation from multiple international agencies, investigators could not determine what happened to this portion of the stolen capital. The gap suggested the syndicate had utilized deeper layering techniques that bypassed the SWIFT network entirely and left no electronic trail accessible to investigators. Possibilities included cash-based commodity trades. The syndicate could have converted portions of the stolen money into physical commodities like gold or gemstones, which could be transported physically across borders without electronic records. Precious stone purchases were another option. Diamonds and other valuable gems are portable, difficult to trace, and can be converted back to cash in major cities worldwide. Traditional money transfer systems like Hawala offered another avenue. Hawala operates through trust networks that transfer value without moving money physically or electronically through banking systems. A Hawala operator in Geneva could accept a deposit and arrange for an equivalent amount to be paid out in Lagos without any funds actually crossing borders, making the transaction invisible to banking regulators. The untraceable $24 million suggested the syndicate's sophistication exceeded what investigators had initially assumed. They were not merely clever con artists exploiting a weak target. They were professionals with deep knowledge of international money laundering techniques, capable of moving substantial sums through channels that left no recoverable trail. This realization had implications for ongoing anti-money laundering efforts. If a syndicate could successfully hide 10% of $242 million despite intensive international investigation, how much criminal money was flowing through the global financial system undetected? In December 1998, Christian Anejimba was killed. The details of his death remain unresolved in any public record. The Nigerian police investigated the killing but produced no definitive findings about who ordered it or carried it out. As a co-lead strategist in the syndicate, Anejimba had managed international accounts and facilitated the movement of tens of millions of dollars. His knowledge of the fraud's mechanics was encyclopedic. He knew which banks had been used, which corporate entities had received funds, which associates had participated in various stages of the operation, and where significant assets had been hidden. His assassination occurred just as the investigation was gaining momentum. Law enforcement agencies in Brazil and Switzerland were coordinating their efforts to trace the funds. Brazilian authorities had realized the scale of the fraud and were seeking international cooperation to pursue the perpetrators. Swiss authorities had frozen accounts and were examining banking records. Nigerian authorities had begun receiving inquiries from international partners asking about specific individuals and companies. The timing of Anejimba's death, coming just as these investigative pressures were mounting, suggested it was not coincidental. Speculation surrounded the motive. One theory held that Anejimba was eliminated by his own associates to consolidate control over the stolen money. If he was removed from the picture, his share of the proceeds could be redistributed among the remaining syndicate members. The killing would also eliminate someone who could potentially cooperate with authorities. If Anejimba faced arrest and prosecution, he might offer testimony against other syndicate members in exchange for leniency. Killing him ensured his silence. Another theory pointed to rival criminal groups seeking to muscle in on the proceeds. The fraud had generated massive publicity within Nigerian criminal circles. Other syndicates would have known that Nwude's group had successfully extracted hundreds of millions from a foreign bank. That success made them targets. Rival groups might have attempted to extort portions of the stolen funds, and Anejimba's refusal to cooperate could have led to his elimination as a warning to the others. A third theory suggested the killing was unrelated to the fraud, stemming instead from personal disputes or other criminal activities. Anejimba was involved in multiple ventures, and any of them could have generated conflicts that ended in violence. This theory gained less traction because of the timing. The killing happened just as the fraud was being exposed internationally, making it unlikely to be coincidental. No definitive conviction was ever secured for his murder. The Nigerian police investigation stalled. Witnesses were either unwilling to come forward or provided contradictory accounts. No physical evidence clearly linked any individual to the killing. The case remained open but unsolved, joining the long list of assassinations in Nigeria where the perpetrators faced no consequences. The killing removed a key figure who could have provided testimony about the syndicate's operations and potentially implicated others in the scheme. His death created a permanent gap in the evidentiary record that would complicate prosecution efforts years later. Amaka Anejimba, Christian's wife, took on a more prominent role after his death. Her increased involvement suggested she had been more deeply engaged in the fraud than her initial support role indicated. She managed portions of the laundered funds, coordinated with other syndicate members, and facilitated continued integration of the money into legitimate investments. Her capabilities became apparent during this period. She understood banking procedures, could negotiate with financial institutions, and made strategic decisions about asset placement. These were not skills typically associated with someone playing a minor administrative support role. Her involvement would later become a focal point of the prosecution when Nigerian authorities finally moved against the syndicate. Investigators viewed her as a critical link in the chain, someone who had both detailed knowledge of the fraud's mechanics and direct access to the stolen funds after Christian's death. Her testimony could potentially implicate others or reveal where hidden assets remained. This made her both a valuable prosecution witness and a target for potential intimidation by others seeking to protect themselves from exposure. When the full scope of the Banco Norost fraud became public, Nigeria was emerging from a decade of corrupt military rule. General Sani Abacha had governed Nigeria from 1993 until his death in 1998, a period marked by pervasive corruption, human rights abuses, and international isolation. Abacha's regime had systematically looted Nigeria's oil revenues, with billions of dollars diverted to offshore accounts controlled by the dictator and his associates. Transparency International consistently ranked Nigeria as one of the most corrupt countries in the world during this period. The international community viewed Nigeria as a kleptocracy where governmental power existed primarily to facilitate theft. The transition to civilian rule under President Olusegun Obasanjo in 1999 created an opportunity for reform, but also exposed the depth of Nigeria's corruption problem. Obasanjo had been a military head of state in the 1970s before voluntarily stepping down to allow civilian rule. His return to power through democratic elections gave him credibility both domestically and internationally. He understood that Nigeria's reputation for corruption was impeding foreign investment, reducing access to international credit, and undermining the government's legitimacy with its own citizens. The international community viewed Nigeria as a safe haven for advanced fee fraud schemes, commonly known as 419 scams, after the section of the Nigerian Criminal Code that addressed fraud by false pretenses. These schemes had proliferated during the 1990s, initially using postal mail and later migrating to email as internet access spread. The schemes typically involved correspondents claiming the sender had access to large sums of money trapped in Nigeria due to bureaucratic complications. If the recipient would provide banking details and pay various fees, they would receive a share of the funds. Victims worldwide had lost millions to these schemes, and Nigeria's government had done little to prosecute the perpetrators. President Obasanjo faced intense pressure to demonstrate that Nigeria would no longer tolerate large-scale financial crime. International partners made clear that continued corruption would affect Nigeria's access to World Bank funding, International Monetary Fund programs, and bilateral aid. Foreign investors demanded credible anti-corruption measures before committing capital to Nigerian projects. Even domestic constituencies, tired of seeing public resources stolen while basic services deteriorated, demanded action. In 2002, at Obasanjo's request, the Nigerian parliament created the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. The EFCC was designed to investigate and prosecute financial crimes, including money laundering, advance fee fraud, corruption involving public officials, and other economically motivated offenses. The legislation creating the EFCC gave it broad powers to investigate, freeze assets, and prosecute cases. The commission could coordinate with international law enforcement agencies, request assistance from foreign governments, and pursue assets that had been moved outside Nigeria. Nuhu Ribadu was appointed as the commission's first chairman. Ribadu was a police officer with a reputation for integrity and competence. He had served in various police units before being selected to lead the EFCC. His appointment signaled that the commission would be led by someone with law enforcement experience rather than a political appointee who might use the position to settle scores or protect allies. Ribadu identified the Nwude case as the most important challenge facing the new agency. The case was symbolically critical. It involved a massive sum, $242 million, making it one of the largest frauds ever perpetrated by Nigerian nationals. It had destroyed a foreign financial institution, giving it international significance. It implicated a senior Nigerian banking official, demonstrating that corruption reached into elite circles. Securing convictions would send a message that even well-connected individuals would face consequences for financial crimes. The prosecution was intended as a performance of sovereignty, a demonstration that Nigeria could and would enforce the rule of law against powerful criminals. The EFCC's investigation traced the flow of funds from Brazil through the global banking system and into Nigerian accounts. This required cooperation from multiple foreign agencies. Brazilian authorities provided documentation about the Banco Noros transfers and Sakaguchi's unauthorized activities. Swiss authorities shared banking records from frozen accounts and facilitated tracing of funds that had passed through Geneva. American authorities provided information about wire transfers processed through J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of New York. The investigation assembled a comprehensive picture of how the money had moved and where it had ended up. Authorities seized assets belonging to Nwude, Akali, and Amaka Anagba. The seized property included shares in Nigerian banks, revealing that Nwude had used stolen funds to acquire stakes in financial institutions. The irony was stark. A banker had defrauded a foreign bank and then invested the proceeds in Nigerian banks, positioning himself as a legitimate shareholder in the sector he had victimized. Seized assets also included luxury vehicles, high-end cars that represented wealth displays typical of Nigerian elite circles. Real estate holdings were frozen, including properties in Lagos, Abuja, and Anambra State. These properties ranged from residential mansions to commercial buildings that generated rental income. The investigation revealed that Nwude had used the proceeds to acquire stakes in financial institutions, effectively reinvesting stolen money into the very sector he had defrauded. This strategy served multiple purposes. It laundered the funds by converting them into legitimate-appearing investments. It generated returns through dividends and capital appreciation. It provided influence within the banking sector that could be used to protect against future investigations. A significant shareholder in a bank could potentially affect decisions about cooperation with regulators or law enforcement. In February 2004, Emmanuel Nwude and his accomplices were arraigned in Abuja High Court on 86 counts of fraud. The number of counts reflected the complexity of the scheme and the prosecution's strategy of charging each element of the fraud separately. Individual counts addressed specific wire transfers, particular false representations, and distinct money laundering transactions. The approach created multiple opportunities for conviction. Even if some counts could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt, the sheer number of charges increased the likelihood that at least some would result in guilty verdicts. The charges included conspiracy to defraud, reflecting the collaborative nature of the scheme. Multiple individuals had worked together to execute the fraud, making conspiracy charges appropriate. Obtaining money by false pretense was the core offense, addressing the false representations about the airport contract that induced Sakaguchi to transfer funds. Money laundering charges addressed the subsequent movement of stolen funds through shell companies and their integration into legitimate investments. The prosecution presented evidence tracing the wire transfers from Banco Noros to accounts controlled by the defendants. Bank records from multiple jurisdictions documented the movement of funds. Wire transfer confirmations showed amounts, dates, sending and receiving accounts, and the individuals who authorized each transfer. Account statements demonstrated how money flowed through intermediary accounts before reaching final destinations controlled by the defendants. This documentary evidence created a paper trail that was difficult to refute. Forensic accountants testified about the layering techniques used to obscure the fund's origin. These expert witnesses explained how money laundering worked, described the specific techniques used by the Nwude syndicate, and demonstrated how investigators had traced funds despite the layering. Their testimony translated complex financial transactions into narratives that judges and potentially juries could understand. They used charts and diagrams to show how money moved between accounts, how shell companies functioned, and how the final assets connected back to the defendants. Documentary evidence from Swiss authorities provided critical links connecting the defendants to the money. The frozen Swiss account controlled by Nwude contained records that proved his beneficial ownership and showed transactions connecting him to the stolen Banco Norost funds. Swiss banking documentation carries significant weight in international prosecutions because Swiss banks maintain meticulous records and Swiss regulatory authorities enforce strict documentation standards. Evidence from Swiss sources is difficult to challenge in court. The trial faced disruptions from the beginning. A bomb scare forced the evacuation of the court on one occasion. The incident occurred during a hearing, disrupting proceedings and creating fear among court personnel and observers. While the bomb threat proved false, it demonstrated that the defendants or their associates were willing to use intimidation tactics to disrupt the judicial process. The message was clear: pursuing this prosecution came with risks. Allegations of massive bribery attempts aimed at court staff circulated throughout the trial. Court employees reported being approached with offers of money to lose documents, delay hearings, or provide advance information about prosecution strategies. Some allegations involved specific amounts, with offers reportedly reaching into six figures for cooperation. The bribery attempts targeted clerks who maintained case files, administrative staff who scheduled hearings, and security personnel who controlled access to court facilities. The pervasiveness of these attempts demonstrated the defendants' desperation and their continued access to substantial financial resources despite asset seizures. The syndicate's continued influence was evident in the obstacles that appeared throughout the proceedings. Witnesses who had agreed to testify suddenly became unavailable or recanted their statements. Documentary evidence that was supposed to be produced disappeared from supposedly secure storage. Defense motions challenged every procedural aspect of the case, creating delays that extended the trial for months. The defense strategy appeared designed to exhaust the prosecution, hoping that witnesses would lose patience, evidence would become stale, or political pressure would force a settlement. Nwude even attempted to bribe Nuhu Rabadu directly, offering him $75,000 in cash. The attempt occurred in a meeting where Nwude requested to speak privately with Rabadu. During that conversation, Nwude produced an envelope containing cash and suggested that Rabadu could benefit financially by allowing certain aspects of the case to be handled more flexibly. The amount was insultingly small relative to the amounts involved in the fraud, suggesting either that Nwude believed Rabadu was cheaply corruptible or that he was testing whether Rabadu was corruptible at all. Rabadu reported the bribery attempt, and the money was logged as evidence. The incident became part of the case file, demonstrating the defendant's willingness to corrupt the judicial process itself. In July 2004, Judge Lawal Gyumi dismissed the case due to lack of jurisdiction. The ruling held that the Abuja High Court did not have territorial authority over offenses that had been committed in multiple locations, including Lagos and international jurisdictions. The dismissal was a technicality, addressing where the trial could properly be held rather than the merits of the charges. The ruling created temporary chaos, as defendants who expected to be freed instead found themselves immediately rearrested. The defendants were rearrested as they left the courthouse. The EFCC had anticipated the possibility of a jurisdiction ruling and had coordinated with prosecutors in Lagos to have new charges ready. As Nwude and the others walked out of the Abuja courthouse, expecting to celebrate their apparent victory, they were taken into custody by waiting officers and transported to Lagos. The prosecution refiled the charges in Lagos High Court, where jurisdiction was uncontested. The Lagos court had clear authority over offenses committed in Lagos, where many of the money laundering transactions had occurred. The trial resumed with essentially the same evidence and charges, now before a different court. On July 15, 2005, Amaka Anejimba changed her plea to guilty. The decision came after negotiations with prosecutors. Amaka's attorney had evaluated the evidence and concluded that conviction was likely. The forensic trail connecting her to the laundered funds was strong. Witness testimony placed her in operational roles after her husband's death. Documentary evidence showed her signature on banking documents and corporate filings. Fighting the charges would likely result in a lengthy trial ending in conviction and a harsher sentence. Pleading guilty offered the opportunity for a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. She was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison and ordered to pay $48.5 million in restitution. The sentence was relatively light compared to the magnitude of the fraud, reflecting the value of her guilty plea and potential cooperation. The $48.5 million restitution represented a portion of the funds traced to her control or benefit. The amount was calculated based on transfers to accounts she controlled, property acquired in her name, and her estimated share of the syndicate's proceeds after her husband's death. On November 18, 2005, Emmanuel Nwude and Nzerib Akali also changed their pleas to guilty. The decision came after months of trial proceedings that had not gone favorably for the defense. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The paper trail was clear. Expert witnesses had explained the fraud's mechanics convincingly. The defendants' attempts at intimidation and bribery had been documented and added to the evidence against them. Continued resistance appeared futile. Changing their pleas to guilty offered the possibility of concluding the process and avoiding an even longer sentence after a full trial ending in conviction. Nwude received a 25-year sentence. The length reflected the severity of the crime, the amount stolen, the institutional damage caused, and Nwude's leadership role in the syndicate. At 25 years, the sentence was among the longest ever imposed for white-collar crime in Nigerian legal history. It sent the message that financial crimes of this magnitude would be punished severely. Akali received 4 years, a much shorter sentence reflecting his lesser role. While Akali had initiated the fraud, Nwude and Anejba had sidelined him and controlled the bulk of the stolen funds. His cooperation during the investigation may also have contributed to the reduced sentence. Nwude was ordered to forfeit $110 million to the victims. This amount represented the portion of the stolen funds that investigators could definitively trace to his control. It included money in frozen bank accounts, the value of seized real estate, and banking sector shares held in his name or through entities he controlled. All seized shares, vehicles, and property were included in the forfeiture. Luxury cars were to be sold at auction with proceeds going to victims. Real estate would be liquidated or transferred directly to victims. Bank shares would be reassigned to provide partial restitution for the Simonson and Cochrane families' losses. An additional $10 million fine was imposed, payable to the Nigerian federal government. This fine represented a penalty to the state, separate from restitution to victims. It acknowledged that the fraud had damaged Nigeria's reputation and required government resources to investigate and prosecute. The fine was intended to be paid from any remaining assets not already allocated to victim restitution. The convictions marked the first major victory for the EFCC. International observers noted the outcome as evidence that Nigeria was beginning to hold its financial criminals accountable. Media coverage in Brazil, the United States, and Europe highlighted that Nigerian authorities had successfully prosecuted one of the largest advance fee frauds in history. The convictions improved Nigeria's standing with international partners and demonstrated that the EFCC was a serious agency capable of handling complex financial crime cases. The sentences were among the longest ever imposed for white-collar crime in Nigerian legal history. Previous financial crime prosecutions had typically resulted in much shorter sentences, often just a few years, and frequently ended in plea bargains that required minimal restitution. The Nwude case established a new standard. Future financial criminals would face the prospect of decades in prison and comprehensive asset forfeiture if caught and convicted. In 2006, Emmanuel Nwude was released from prison. He had served approximately 1 year of his 25-year sentence. The release shocked international observers who had viewed the conviction as evidence that Nigeria was serious about combating financial crime. Questions immediately arose about how someone sentenced to 25 years could be free after 12 months. The exact circumstances of his release remain unclear in public records. No official documentation explaining the early release has been made public. No court order reducing the sentence appears in accessible legal databases. Several theories circulated about the release. One held that Nwude had bribed officials in the prison system and judiciary to secure his freedom. Given his demonstrated willingness to attempt bribes during the trial and his continued access to hidden assets, this theory was plausible. Prison officials might have accepted payment to falsify records showing good behavior or medical necessity for compassionate release. Judges might have been paid to issue orders reducing the sentence or granting parole. The amounts required to corrupt enough officials to secure release would have been substantial, but Nwude had demonstrated access to tens of millions in hidden assets. Another theory suggested that political pressure played a role. Nwude's traditional title and social standing in Anambra State meant he had connections to political figures. Local politicians might have intervened with federal authorities to secure his release, either because of personal relationships or because of political contributions. Nigerian politics during this period involved complex patronage networks where favors were routinely traded. A politician with influence in the federal government might secure the release of a constituent in exchange for electoral support or financial backing. A third theory held that the release was part of a deal where Nwude provided information about other criminal activities or agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations. This theory gained less credence because no subsequent prosecutions appeared to result from Nwude's cooperation, and he showed no signs of cooperating with authorities after his release. What is clear is that Nwude immediately began filing lawsuits to recover seized assets. His first priority upon release was not maintaining a low profile but aggressive litigation to reclaim property that had been forfeited as part of his conviction. He retained prominent attorneys and filed cases in multiple courts challenging the asset forfeitures. He argued that many of his holdings had been acquired before the fraud and therefore should not be subject to forfeiture. The legal theory was that only assets purchased with stolen funds could legitimately be seized. If Nwude could prove that specific properties had been acquired with legitimate income from his position at Union Bank before the fraud began, those properties should be returned. Nigerian courts entertained these claims over the following years. The cases dragged through the judicial system with extensive evidence presentations, expert testimony about asset valuation and timing, and procedural motions that delayed resolution. Legal arguments centered on the timing of asset acquisition and whether prosecutors could prove that specific properties were purchased with stolen funds rather than with Nwude's legitimate earnings. The burden of proof varied depending on the specific legal proceeding, with some cases requiring prosecutors to prove criminal origin while others required Nwude to prove legitimate origin. The litigation revealed weaknesses in the original asset forfeiture process. Prosecutors had seized all assets they could identify as belonging to Nwude, operating under the assumption that someone earning a director's salary at Union Bank could not legitimately have accumulated the wealth he displayed. This assumption was reasonable but difficult to prove definitively. Nigerian corporate records and tax documentation from the 1990s were incomplete. Banking records showing the sources of funds used to purchase specific properties had not always been preserved. Without clear documentation showing that a particular property was purchased with stolen money, courts were reluctant to permanently forfeit it. Eventually, Nwude successfully reclaimed at least $52 million in assets. The recovered assets included real estate properties in Lagos and Abuja that he claimed had been purchased in the early 1990s with legitimate income and inheritance. They included shares in Nigerian companies that he argued had been acquired through stock market purchases before the fraud began. They included cash balances in accounts that he claimed represented rental income from legitimate properties or dividends from legitimate investments. Whether these claims were true was contested, but Nwude's attorneys presented enough documentation to convince courts that the assets should not be forfeited. The recovery raised fundamental questions about the permanence of asset forfeiture in cases involving sophisticated financial criminals. Asset forfeiture is supposed to ensure that criminals cannot benefit from their crimes. The principle is that stolen money and property purchased with stolen money should be returned to victims or seized by the state. In practice, achieving permanent forfeiture is difficult when defendants have resources to mount lengthy legal challenges. Nwude had the financial means to retain excellent attorneys. He had the time to pursue litigation while out of prison. He had sufficient understanding of the legal system to identify procedural weaknesses in the original forfeiture process. The victims of the fraud, primarily the Simonson and Cochran families who had bailout out Banco Norost, received only partial restitution. The families had injected $242 million of personal funds to replace the stolen capital. The restitution order against Nwude was for $110 million, less than half the stolen amount. Of that $110 million, the actual amount recovered and transferred to victims was even less, as legal fees, administrative costs, and difficulties converting seized assets to cash reduced the net amount available. Nwude's successful recovery of $52 million further reduced what victims ultimately received. Of the $242 million stolen, approximately $184 million was traced through forensic accounting. The remaining $58 million was never located. Of the $184 million traced, a substantial portion could not be recovered because it had been spent, converted to untraceable assets, or successfully hidden in jurisdictions that did not cooperate with Nigerian authorities. The gap between the amount stolen and the amount recovered highlighted the ongoing challenge for anti-corruption agencies. Even successful prosecutions do not necessarily result in making victims whole. Stripping a mastermind of financial power proves difficult when they possess the resources to engage in decades-long legal battles. Nwude demonstrated this principle clearly. Despite conviction, imprisonment, and asset forfeiture, he emerged from the process with substantial wealth intact. His ability to recover $52 million suggests that significantly more remained hidden. The untraceable $24 million identified by investigators was only the portion they knew existed, but could not find. Additional funds may have been successfully concealed through techniques that left no trace investigators could detect. On August 19, 2016, Emmanuel Nwude was arrested as a ringleader in a violent land dispute in the Ukpo and Abigana areas of Anambra State. The arrest came 11 years after his conviction for the Banco Noroeste fraud and 10 years after his unexplained release from prison. The charges involved murder and what authorities described as terrorist attacks related to contested land ownership. The details revealed a pattern of violence surrounding disputed property in areas where Nwude held traditional authority as the Owel of Abigana. Land disputes in Nigeria frequently involve violence, particularly in areas where traditional land tenure systems conflict with modern property law. Traditional rulers often claim authority over land within their domains, while state governments assert legal ownership of unregistered land. Individuals holding government-issued titles may find their claims contested by traditional leaders who argue that the land belongs to the community under customary law. These disputes can escalate to violence when competing claimants hire armed groups to enforce their claims physically. The specific allegations against Nwude involved ordering attacks on individuals who contested his land claims. According to prosecutors, Nwude had claimed ownership of substantial tracts of land in Ukpo and Abigana. When other claimants attempted to occupy or develop the disputed land, armed groups attacked them. Some attacks resulted in deaths. Properties were destroyed. The violence was systematic enough that authorities characterized it as terrorist activity rather than isolated criminal incidents. The charges suggested that Nwude had transitioned from financial crime to violent enforcement of property claims. The transition was not as dramatic as it might appear. The Banco Noroeste fraud had involved no physical violence, but violence had touched the syndicate with Christian Anajimba's assassination. Nwude's willingness to use force to protect his interests should not have been surprising. Individuals who defraud foreign banks of hundreds of millions are not typically constrained by moral considerations about using violence when circumstances require it. The land dispute charges remained contested in court. Nwude's attorneys argued that he was being targeted due to his prominence and that the criminal charges were manufactured by opponents in political and business disputes. They characterized the prosecution as politically motivated, an attempt by rivals to use the judicial system to undermine Nwude's position. Whether these defense claims had merit remained unclear, but they highlighted that Nwude continued to be involved in conflicts that generated criminal charges more than a decade after his first major conviction. On February 25, 2021, Nwude appeared in the Ikeja Special Offenses Court facing 15 counts of forgery. These charges were directly connected to the original Banco Noroeste fraud. The prosecution alleged that Nwude had forged documents in an attempt to reclaim or transfer ownership of property he had been ordered to forfeit to his victims as part of the 2005 conviction. The forgeries allegedly involved backdating documents to make it appear that property transfers had occurred before the fraud, supporting his claims that the properties were acquired legitimately and should not have been forfeited. The charges also addressed allegations that Nwude had created false corporate records to obscure the beneficial ownership of assets. By creating documents showing that properties were held by companies owned by third parties, he could argue that the properties were not his and therefore not subject to forfeiture. The forgeries were sophisticated, requiring knowledge of corporate record-keeping practices and the ability to create documents that would survive initial scrutiny. The case was ongoing as of the most recent available records. Court proceedings had been delayed by procedural motions, challenges to evidence admissibility, and scheduling conflicts. The pattern mirrored the original fraud trial, where extensive delays had prolonged proceedings for years. Nwude's defense strategy appeared to rely on exhausting prosecutors and hoping that witnesses and evidence would become less effective over time. The pattern suggested that the Nwude era had not ended with his 2005 conviction. The era referred not just to a period, but to a mode of operation characterized by exploiting institutional weaknesses, using social connections to evade consequences, and persistently pursuing financial gain regardless of legal constraints. Nwude continued to operate within Nigerian legal and financial systems, attempting to recover assets, engaging in disputes over land, and facing new criminal charges. His activities demonstrated that conviction and imprisonment had not ended his career but merely interrupted it. His reappearance in court 15 years after his initial conviction demonstrated that the vulnerabilities he had exploited in 1995 remained exploitable in different forms. The specific tactics had changed. He was no longer impersonating central bank governors to defraud foreign banks, but the underlying patterns persisted. He still used his social standing and connections to pursue objectives that brought him into conflict with the law. He still had access to resources that allowed him to mount sophisticated legal defenses. He still operated with apparent confidence that he could navigate the judicial system successfully despite previous convictions. Emmanuel Nwude returned to Nigerian courts in 2016 and again in 2021, facing charges related to violence and forgery. His reappearances 15 and 20 years after the original fraud suggest that the conviction and imprisonment were not endpoints but interruptions in a continuing pattern. The charges in 2016 involved violent land disputes, indicating escalation from financial crime to physical violence in pursuit of property claims. The charges in 2021 addressed forgery of documents related to previously forfeited assets, demonstrating continued efforts to reclaim wealth supposedly confiscated as part of his punishment. The pattern reveals limitations in the criminal justice response to sophisticated financial crime. Nwude was caught, prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. By conventional measures, the system worked, yet he served minimal prison time despite a 25-year sentence. He recovered substantial assets despite comprehensive forfeiture orders. He continues to operate within Nigerian legal and business systems despite his criminal record. The system processed him, but did not neutralize him as a threat or permanently deprive him of the resources to continue problematic activities. The vulnerabilities he identified in 1995 have not disappeared. Banks still operate on trust, assuming that counterparties presenting appropriate credentials are legitimate. Officials still rely on documents bearing official seals and authentication markers to verify identities and authorities. International transfers still move through multiple jurisdictions with varying levels of oversight, creating gaps that sophisticated criminals can exploit. The mechanics of global finance remain fundamentally unchanged despite regulatory reforms following the fraud's exposure. The fraud's core elements remain replicable. Impersonation of authority figures is still possible for individuals with insider knowledge of how those figures present themselves and what language they use. Fabrication of infrastructure projects or commercial opportunities continues to provide pretexts for inducing payments. Exploitation of victims' sunk costs through progressive escalation of requests remains psychologically effective. Shell companies in favorable jurisdictions still provide mechanisms for obscuring beneficial ownership and laundering funds. What has changed is the level of scrutiny and the sophistication of detection systems. Banks have implemented better controls on individual authorization, though gaps remain. International cooperation in tracing funds has improved, though jurisdictional friction still creates delays. Forensic accounting techniques have advanced, making it harder to hide large sums completely. These changes increase the difficulty of conducting a fraud at the scale Nwude achieved, but they do not make it impossible. The fact that significant portions of the money were never recovered raises questions about the true cost of sophisticated financial crime. The direct loss to Banco Noreste was $242 million. The bank's owners absorbed this through personal bailout, but the total social cost was higher. Investigation and prosecution required substantial public resources. Brazilian, Swiss, American, and Nigerian authorities dedicated years of effort by experienced investigators, prosecutors, and forensic accountants. These resources could have been applied to other priorities if the fraud had not occurred. The bank's collapse resulted in job losses and service disruptions affecting thousands of people. The destruction of institutional knowledge and relationships built over 78 years of operations represented a loss that cannot be quantified purely financially. The damage to Nigeria's international reputation impeded foreign investment and increased the cost of international commerce for all Nigerian businesses, as foreign counterparties demanded additional assurances and protections. The mastermind served minimal prison time despite the magnitude of his crime. 1 year of imprisonment for stealing $242 million and destroying a major financial institution suggests that the personal cost to Nwude was far less than the social cost his crime imposed. He continues to operate within Nigerian legal and financial systems decades later, facing new charges but apparently maintaining substantial resources and social position. The disparity between the harm caused and the punishment endured raises questions about whether the criminal justice system provides adequate deterrence for this category of crime. The case demonstrates that one individual with insider knowledge and the ability to project legitimacy can subvert institutional trust and extract hundreds of millions before detection. The requirements are not exotic. A position providing knowledge of banking procedures, the ability to forge or obtain authentic-appearing documents, understanding of victim psychology, and access to a network capable of layering and integrating stolen funds. These requirements are possessed by numerous individuals worldwide, particularly those working within financial institutions or adjacent professional services. The question posed by the Nwude case is whether the global financial system learned from the fraud or merely absorbed it as an acceptable cost of doing business across borders. The reforms implemented after the fraud's exposure suggest some learning occurred. Controls were tightened, oversight was enhanced, international cooperation improved, but the fundamental structure remains unchanged. Trillions of dollars move across borders daily through systems that rely on trust and assume good faith among participants. The fraud cost $242 million and destroyed a major bank. If the global financial system processes trillions daily, a $242 million loss represents a tiny fraction of total activity. From a systemic perspective, the fraud might be viewed as a bearable cost. an inevitable consequence of maintaining a system optimized for speed and efficiency rather than perfect security. This calculation suggests that similar frauds will continue occurring, that sophisticated criminals with insider knowledge will continue identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities, and that the system will continue absorbing these losses rather than implementing changes that might reduce efficiency. Nwude's continued legal troubles and his apparent maintenance of substantial resources decades after his conviction suggest that for the mastermind, the fraud was ultimately successful despite the prosecution. He achieved his objective of extracting enormous wealth. He faced consequences but survived them with resources intact. He continues to pursue his interests through legal and illegal means, apparently confident in his ability to navigate challenges. From his perspective, the system did not defeat him. It merely imposed costs that proved bearable given the rewards he obtained.